So the Healing Justice Dialogue Series, again, our aims are to increase our understanding and consciousness around structural racism and violence, to raise awareness about the historical trauma and oppression of communities, and how this has impacted individual community wellness. The dialogue series is also to help us to learn from the resilience of diverse and indigenous communities and examine experience non-traditional ways of healing, and also to create a community of healing and restorative justice, and to heighten awareness and community activism. And so I'd like to welcome again all of you, the audience and panelists. I'd like to thank our panelists, Tanuja Devi, Sangeetha Ravichandran, for agreeing to be here with us this evening for our inaugural event. And a big shout out to all of you who have zoomed in to be with us this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors and the staff who have really helped to make this possible. Let's thank the Department of Social Work, Critical Ethnic Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, Community Service Studies, and American Studies. Thanks also to those who are on Zoom helping us, Jewel Daly, the Assistant Director of the Center for Black Diaspora. Hi, Jewel.
Hi everyone.
Let's thank Jessica Williams, who's also in the Center for Black Diaspora.
Hello.
Jennifer Ogumiki.
Hi.
And Priya White, who is in the Center for Community Health Equity.
Hello.
A little about Tanuja. Tanuja is a playwright and practitioner of transformative and healing justice. When she is not creating spaces for mutual aid, collective creation, and transformative dialogue, she works for the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization as their operations and just culture manager. She believes in creating strong containers for the next world. Sangeetha Ravichandran is a queer South Asian activist scholar, an art therapist, and a current PhD student at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the sociology program. She has worked alongside survivors of interpersonal and state violence for over 10 years. Her current research examines biosurveillance through its interlinks with carcerality, US liberal counterinsurgencies, and feminism. She currently organizes with Love and Protect. Please welcome. I'm so happy that you're here with us. Thank you.
So wonderful to be here. Thank you for having us. Absolute honor.
Yeah, and thank you for, thanks everyone for being here. I see lots of, I see some familiar names from the Chicago abolitionist space, which is a small world, and so many of you new faces. It's so wonderful to see all of you and share space with you. Thanks for having us. I want to just quickly, I'm Sangi, some things that Tanuja and I will try to do today. I will say my name every time I start speaking for folks who don't have access to, who don't have visual access. I'll also describe how, what I look like for folks who don't have that access. I am a South Asian person with sort of what they say in South Asia, wheatish complexion, if that makes any sense to you. I'm wearing brown sweater with kind of a turtleneck, and I'm wearing a ruby Pinto's necklace, a guillotine necklace, and I have a chili colored lipstick on, and I have my reading glasses that I wear in and out. I'm sitting in my sunroom with lights and some other images and plants around me.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm Tanuja, and I'm also a South Asian person. I am what we call in Guyana thick. So I'm wearing a headset, I'm wearing glasses, I'm wearing some eye makeup. I'm wearing some like a burgundy lip, if you will, that kind of coordinates, matches with my top, which is like a little bit lacy on the shoulder. Anyway, I'm sitting next to my favorite books and my passion planner. And oh, and I'm wearing hoop earrings that my mother gave me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we want to kind of, this is Sangi. Today we will kind of start talking about where we come into this work, or how we come into this work, and what is our practice and how do you describe it? So Tanuja, where do you come into this? How and where do you come into this work? What is your practice right now, and how do you want to tell us about it?
Sure. So what I'm currently practicing, and I feel like I've been given beautiful gifts of access to different spaces where I can explore what practicing looks like. So one of the things that I've had the chance to do since basically the pandemic began, I'm really talking about right now, right? So through the Edgewater Mutual Aid Network, currently collaborating with some people on creating NADA circles, National Acupuncture Detoxification Association ear acupuncture circles. It's a protocol that is often used for supporting people who are working with addictions, but also chronic and acute levels of trauma. So we're working on ways to build what we're calling healing justice practice spaces, and we can talk about what that is. There's also a formation of Black, Indigenous, and POC playwrights, and we're working on ways to bring more theater makers into conversation with mutual aid, really trying to build that intersection and connection. So we'll be having some conversations about what is no longer acceptable inside of the theater space in terms of toxic white supremacy and other practices that really further marginalize already marginalized people trying to make theater. And then another really cool collaboration that has come out of the pandemic times and really trying to build on mutual aid is there's a group of people who were kind of, we're still figuring out what we are, what we do, how we operate, but we're people who are committed to the practice of conflict resolution from a prison abolitionist frame. And so we're trying to help share and build skills and practices with other people practicing mutual aid. And I'll talk about the clearing circles that we're trying to get started based on Shira Hassan's training of us. And I'm featuring these things because they're the unpaid practice of frameworks that I think bring together, healing justice, prison abolition, and transformative justice. I'll stop there, but I feel like, how do I describe it? I do try to keep on figuring out what is healing justice. How does it really get practiced in concrete moments of need? I'm really trying to still figure out what mutual aid really looks like. I'm trying to figure out what transformative justice looks like. And then also prison abolition, right? How to, advance the everyday practice of it in every single space I get to exist in and explore in, without turning it into the next commodified individualistic practice of self-care, for instance, right? So anyways, so I feel like I'm in constant questioning and constant exploration, and I just feel grateful. I feel grateful to be able to do that with different formations. How about you, Sangi? What are you practicing right now? And how do you think about it?
Yeah, I feel like I have to start with, saying that I entered the work from being a therapist and working in the anti-violence movement. And my dearest friend, Rachel Kaitor, and I say that we are refugees of the nonprofit. And I mean that every day. I think about that every day. What a great escape. I'm very sarcastic in my speech, and I'm very cynical. So if, that's where I'm coming from with a lot of these statements, I think, for those of you that don't know me. I think, so I come from that space, and I think I come from a lot of really amazing mentors that I have had. I have had the privilege and sort of been lucky and very grateful to have been in similar spaces with them and share spaces with them and learn from them. And one of them, of course, is Anne Russo, who's right here, and Miriam Kaba and Beth Ritchie. And, I have to name them. Shira Hassan, that Tanuja already named, Rachel Kaitor, and all my comrades who organize with me, Kelly, Dina, all these people are where I come from, right, in so many ways. And so I want to lift them up before I say anything, because I don't think anything I can say, anything I do, anything I practice right now can exist in isolation without any of these people. They have all taught me and influenced me and helped me think, helped me ask questions and not constantly be in pursuit of answers, but stay in the questions and in the messy, right? So, and what does my practice look like? As you heard in the introduction, my organizing home is Love and Protect, and that's a lot of what my work looks like now. And I think a lot of my work looks like pushing back to not make my politics my paid life. And sort of stepping away from that and recognizing that, I went into being a therapist looking for and thinking about healing, but then really quickly recognizing that it doesn't happen within that context often. It could, but it doesn't necessarily isolate itself to that space. While it can aid, therapy can perhaps like aid our own processes and things, healing happens in community. Healing happens in relationships. And so that's what my work looks like. And being in Love and Protect has really taught me how to sort of move through that, and how to think about abolition as not an isolated event that's about to happen when we get to this some kind of utopia, right? But I think about how all of these are practices that we kind of have to constantly be thinking about, constantly be working on, and how we're all works in progress, right? And I think my practice also looks like sort of being in. I tell some of my friends I've intentionally created a bubble that I live in, and I am for no reason willing to step out of this bubble that I created with so much emotional labor and so much thought labor that has gone into creating this bubble that I live in. And I want to expand the bubble, but I don't necessarily want to step outside of it, right? Within this bubble, how do we create intentional community with each other? And how do we really show up for each other, right? And so my work also looks like that. And with this pandemic, in this moment, as Tanuja was saying, I think my work has kind of looked in very small in some ways, or like, I'm not trying to, it looks like micro moments, and it looks like sort of these like things that involve my everyday life. My gardening partners on this call somewhere, I think, but we grow food, and I think that that's a big part of embracing healing justice and abolition as a part of our lives, as a part of our values. It looks like sort of thinking about what is happening in the mutual aid space, what's happening in the grieving space, and what are some ways that we can show up and give to that with the capacity that I have, right? I'm able to do 2 things, then fuck, I'll do that, right? Like, and this is what a comrade needs, and I'll show up in that way, right? I think showing up in this moment, holding your values of like abolition, not as an event, but as a value, and showing up, being true to your capacity as much as you possibly can. I struggle with this, but as much as you possibly can. And really, and being an accomplice, right, in sort of the change work, and looking at the struggle and seeing the struggle and being real about that, and like showing up for it. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but Tanuja and I were sort of doing small different pieces with the We Grieve Together memorial that happened. And so like, how do we think about grief as a part of healing? How do we think about grief as a part of abolition? What role does that play, right? So being in thinking community with each other too is what my work looks like. Yeah, I kind of went all over the place and rambled a little bit, but our work is messy, and my work are a testament to how messy our work is. So.
Well, no, Sangi, you're absolutely brilliant. And, I really love the way that you brought in your co-thinkers and those who've taught you, and, the legacy of brilliance that you're rooted in. I'd like to do the same if that's okay, because we have overlap, and I'm just going to embarrass Rachel right now. So in 2001, when I came to Chicago from Arizona, sort of running away from white supremacist Arizona, I found myself volunteering for the Chicago Rape Crisis Hotline in 2001. And my supervisor and trainer was one Rachel Kydor. Rachel and Koya Paz and Vicky Sides were the trainers. They did my 40-hour training. And when I tell you, yes, that training was like everything, I mean it. It was everything. I got instantly schooled in, wow, Black feminist radical tradition and how that connects to feminist counseling, right? And so learned right away, like, okay, this is how you come correct to this work. Then I went to acupuncture school, which is a whole story, a whole thing. But similar to what you were saying, Sangi, I was really inspired by street medics. I took a street medic training in 2003, and I was like, I'm going to go to acupuncture school because my street medic trainer was an acupuncturist. And, I'm here to really advance global public health and bring these tools of non-Western medicine and things to the people. And I was like, okay, let's go to acupuncture school. If you're really serious about it, be about it. And I really thought like my classmates were on the same frequency. And in 2003, in my first class in acupuncture school, I got a rude awakening because people were not talking about, becoming barefoot doctors and whatnot, right? They're talking about the salon spa practice that they're trying to get into. And but I'm a stubborn a-hole. And so I was like, no, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to, now that I understand there are no jobs, I'm going to create my own job. And so I did, with a collective. Eventually, first I had to wait for a couple people to graduate. So I learned how to create and run a private practice, which is like a whole story. In 2010, however, Liz Apple, Jennifer Wade, Stacy Ehrenberg, and we created a collective called Sage Community Health Collective. And that collective was committed to, don't go to the website, it's like some weird, by the way, like it's some weird, like, relic of what it was. I think it's like leftover data that I need to remove or something. But anyway, we created a 4-person collective that was committed to harm reduction, trauma-informed practice, body positivity, and we were really trying to create a model of operating that was counter to the patient practitioner dynamic that we had kind of learned in school, right? Where, here's the practitioner and here's the patient, and the practitioner acts upon the patient. We really wanted to disrupt that power relationship as much as possible, right? So we spent about, 8 to 10 months really getting our thoughts together, getting our mission together, getting our work together. And in 2010, that's when I learned about the concept of healing justice from Kara Page, who is a member of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. Stacey and I both were working with the Young Women's Empowerment Project, which was co-directed by Shira Hassan and Dominique McKinney. And so we met Kara Page through YWEP. YWEP is no longer around, but I think you can still find the Young Women's Empowerment Project website if you look for it. And so in terms of education, YWEP, taught us about harm reduction, absolutely. YWEP served young folks involved in the sex trade and street economies, and absolutely practiced healing justice and harm reduction every single day in all of those like minute activities you're referencing, Sangi, right? So we learned just what it looked like and how it felt, and we tried to bring that ethic into SAGE. So at SAGE we offered sliding scale services. We wanted our work to be financially accessible to people, all Chicagoans, but primarily, Black, queer, brown folks, and our social justice freedom fighters, right? We really wanted to create a space where our folks could come and get a little bit of rest and rejuvenation, because many people, I'm sure they're on this call right now, right, are balancing, like, what does it look like to work a full-time 9-to-5 job wherever it is, lots of people work in the nonprofit, and then also fight for freedom outside of that, on the weekends, in the evenings, attending meetings, grabbing dinner right before you go to the meeting, and so on and so forth. So we just really wanted to create some kind of healing within liberation for our people. And we absolutely ran into complications, contradictions, and I ended up closing SAGE in 2016, and I can talk more about that if we get there. But yeah, absolutely. I'm with you, Sangi, 100%. Like I'm here only because, queer, Black, and brown, mostly women and femmes and gender nonconforming people were like, Tanuja, hi, work with us, learn with us, listen and practice, right? That's it. I'm grateful.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for lifting up all those names. Just felt very warm to have them, sort of their energy in the space. And if Rachel Keider's on this call, we're both going to get a nice talking to. But I did interview at the same Y that you were at with Rachel Keider, and she did not give me the job. I will still, till today.
What did you apply for?
I think like a hotline coordinator position or something like that back in 2008 or 7, and she interviewed me and didn't give it to me. Just saying. But she
was like, you don't want this job. You do not want this.
I know. Yeah, she says that she was trying to protect me, but I don't know if Rachel Kaitor is going to speak tomorrow, but Love and Protect is going to be doing another talk tomorrow. And if you want to know who these people are, you should go to that talk that Anne will tell you about in the end. I do want to, you brought up and sort of like gave us some words, right, in bringing Sage in bringing Kara Page. Maybe it'll be helpful for us to sort of get into, tell people what we mean by these things, right? So what do we mean by healing and healing justice? And of course, yours and my definition could converge and diverge at points. But, you know, what do we mean by that? And what do we mean by mutual aid and abolition? Because abolition, believe it or not, I never thought I would see this day so soon, but has become a fad. And some of that is exciting and some of that is scary. So it might be useful to bring what we mean by that.
Absolutely. Where do you want to begin?
Kara Page, or you want to?
Let's do it. Yeah. Let's do it. Yeah. And the definition of healing justice that I operate from and have operated from since, 2010, when I went to the US Social Forum and had the opportunity to create a healing justice practice space with, a number of amazing, brilliant healers from all over the country. But this is the definition I use, right? And I'll put it also in the chat, and maybe that can be shared either now or tomorrow as part of the notes. But I think of it as a framework that identifies how we holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence. And it really is about bringing collective practices to transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. And the goal is to use this framework in order to build convergences and political and philosophical convergences of healing inside of our movements and our organizations. So let me just drop that into the chat.
Thank you. And, I think about this a lot because I feel like we kind of have gone so far away from how I think of healing. And Tanuja and I talked about this, is that like healing's not candles and roses and spa and fun. Healing's ugly, healing's messy, healing's just fucking hard, and healing is just it's about time. Like healing justice is anti-capitalist because it's all of it is throughout our lives. Like it doesn't sort of begin and end in these ways because we are going to be works in progress, right? And so it sort of doesn't end, and it's sort of woven through our lifetime. If we're thinking about healing justice and it's existing in community, it's not something outside, right? Like it's not something outside that you go and like grab. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's not something we're familiar with because we are taught not to prioritize healing, right? And not just this, I'm going to put myself first thing. I was going to say bullshit, but sometimes it can be bullshit, sometimes it's not. It's complicated. It's about like, how do we sort of prioritize healing our communities? How do we actually interrupt intergenerational harm, as Tanuja was talking about? And how do we sort of reach outside of the frameworks that we have that are given to us by the system that we live within, and think outside of that and like engage in this like lifelong process, right? For us and for others. Like it's not just about ourselves. It just can't be, right? That just is not sustainable. And I also often think that healing, when we hear healing, I feel like often healing is presented, it's very ableist. And so I think we have to think about healing justice from a disability context. And I was just, I'm a part of this Abolition and Disability Justice Coalition, and we just had an event, a roundtable, and in that roundtable, Yolo Kili said, you know, healing justice is like connected healing justice and mutual aid, that it has to, it's all in part of that same continuum, right? And healing justice is mutual aid and is abolition, right? Like healing justice is mutual aid and mutual aid is a part of abolition. So this all sort of is actually, you know, a part of the same continuum, and we should be doing it on a continuum. We should be thinking about it on this continuum. How are we in relationship to others, in relationship to the world, in relationship to abolition, in relationship to justice and harm that we all, like, and harm is also individual and sort of this interpersonal aspect and systemic, right? So it sort of is all kind of wound up in this, I don't know, is it a triangle, circle, some kind of shape together. But we have to think about healing from a non-ableist perspective, and that's really, really, I feel like is really key that Yolo Kili said, and I want us to center that here as well. Tanuja.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, you know, for me, and I'm just going to bring it to the real talk, right? Like I grew up in Arizona. I grew up in very heavy, deep white supremacy culture. I'm also, I was born in British Guyana, or formerly British Guyana in South America. And when I was 1, my parents and we were sponsored to come to the United States and live with my uncle. Anywho, but you know, we are part of the Indo-Caribbean diaspora, and I do think of myself as a post-colonial subject. The colonization is really deep, and as a 41-year-old, I do feel like I'm really continuing to grapple with the deeply embedded white supremacy culture and how that has showed up in my efforts to practice healing justice, and to organize. And so I really think taking the opportunity to, you know, really use resources like this article by dismantling racism on, you know, what are the characteristics of white supremacy culture. I'm also going to throw those into the chat as well. And what I'm doing is, because we know, or at least I hope we know, or are learning, or are open to learning, right? How white supremacy and capitalism really help to advance, right? Our prison culture, as Mariam Kaba puts it. White supremacy and capitalism help to advance anti-Blackness, right, in all of our spaces, and all of our institutions, and all of our well-intentioned formations. So when we get to think about mutual aid being an opportunity to really change our social relations, right? The way we actually relate to one another, rooted in mutual struggle, right? For our collective common benefit, right? To me, it really means like doing some of that internal interrogation work too. Not only doing that, right? I can't just sit here and read. I'd love to do that, trust me, you know, and journal, you know, a lot of people know I love my journals, but no, like I have to bring it into practice. I have to, against my highly privatized self, right? I have to act against my own very privatized instincts, right? To say, okay, here's where I need to have a boundary, and here's where my quote unquote boundary is artificially a little too rigid, right? Or who is really at the center, what is really at the center of what it is that I'm doing, right? You know, it's something that I have seen Mariam Kaba say in many places, many times, you know, things worth doing happen with other people, right? That honestly goes very much against the white supremacy culture, individualism of like, you gotta be the hero, you're going to get your degree and become like the universal healer, right? Who can heal them all, you know, superhero kind of stuff, martyrdom kind of, right? So I think it's deep, right? Um, and I think in loving community, in spaces where we can actually have these real talk conversations and be kind of like, all right, I can show up with this capacity, and thank you for understanding that my capacity is going to change, you know, and lifting up kinds of examples that I can think of most recently, you know, where we were creating a project. For instance, I had the honor and gift of having a chance to work with Kelly Hayes to create the Mutual Aid Mourning and Healing Project, right after the pandemic really hit, because Kelly, being a brilliant abolitionist and also just brilliant creative and brilliant organizer, was like, okay, God damn it, excuse my language, but people are beginning to die. Our government is failing us in so many ways. This is going to get really bad. So we're seeing death. We're seeing a financial just kind of abandonment of American people. How can we all come together not only to acknowledge the death that's being swept under the rug, but then to fill the gaps? What do we have access to? To whom do we have access? How do we bring together the resources to which we have access and make them available, right? So, you know, it ended up being this really wonderful project, and unfortunately, in the development stages, you know, Kelly was very open about like, hey, if I get sick, you know, how do we work? How do we keep the project in development? And so we worked out a way for the project to be sustaining so that people can move in and can kind of move out as needed. So at this point, you know, it is a pretty cool project with several people involved. We have volunteers and we have a nice rotation, but if someone does get sick and needs to really tag out, they can. Do you know what I mean? And so we've spread the responsibility around, and there isn't just one expert who's in charge. There isn't one name that's on this thing. It really has been a really lovely collaboration that is continuing. And in the process, we've gotten to know each other a little bit, and you know, we feel some level of connection that wasn't there before, and I think that's really special. Yeah, I'm saying a lot of words. I'm gonna pass it. Sangi. But yeah, you know, yeah.
I just wanted to lift up some of the things that you were saying. You know, the piece about when you said, how do we make this project sustainable, right? Like, how do projects not rely on one person? And I think that there's something there for all of us to learn and practice. And I just wanted to lift that up. And I think that goes to talk about values of all these three concepts that we're talking about today, right? This idea of expertise and this idea of one leader and this idea of like fame or like social justice fame and social justice popularity is so fucking toxic. And I think that and those ideas persist in a lot of spaces, including mutual aid, right? I think there's different kinds of mutual aid that's happening around the city now. There's one that's sort of like white-led that's going to lead to a terrible like gentrification impact and is going to push people out. That is for white people, led by white people, thinking they are, you know, Good Samaritan charity bullshit. And then there's the mutual aid that is about this thing that you're talking about. So in one way, I see this sort of mourning project upholding the values of what mutual aid should be, right? Where everyone has roles, and that it's not sort of reliant on few individuals' backs, because we need to make this work sustainable, because we need this work to not be about a popularity contest, not about who has more Twitter followers. Like, that's not what this is about, right? Liberation is not about who is standing on this dais. And I think liberation is not about expertise. So if we were to actually engage in this work, we do need to shed all those layers and question why we're stepping into the work and what is the attraction for the work. A lot of people come into abolition, come into sort of any of these things that we're talking about because it feels like it's the thing right now, right? It's the hot topic. And, you know, we also all want to be validated and acknowledged. And I think there's a different space for that. We need to seek validation and acknowledgement in our interpersonal close relationships, and that's enough. I think liberation work is not about that. I think that we need to separate the two and really think about what is it that we're in here for, right? And what is the sort of goal here? Because if we center ourselves, which is often what white supremacy culture does, if we're sort of focused on what is it that we're getting out of it, where's the visibility, then we're continuing to do the work of we're continuing to do the oppressive work, right? And so we have to constantly question our motivations. And I'm not saying that I'm absolved of this, right? We're so steeped in this white supremacy culture and this capitalist culture that, like, we think that that's what means benefits. We somehow rely on those things in order to build a life, and we have to constantly uproot those things as they come up, right? These thorns will keep popping up, and we have to keep working on it. Yeah, ultimately. And I think the same thing's happening with abolition, right? Abolition is becoming co-opted in these really ugly ways. And I have so much frustration about it, so I don't want to make this a bitch fest, but, you know, I think that co-optation will continue to happen, but we can't be the ones that are doing that, right? Like, we can't be the ones that are sort of, if we're in this for liberation, it's a very different game than if we're sort of in this for co-optation and institutionalizing liberation work. So I think that those separations, those boundaries, those questions are always having to be constant, no matter, even if you're Angela Davis, I really hope that these questions are happening, right? So yeah, I think that I was thinking about that as you were talking about the We Grieve Together project. I feel like something else, I mean, I'm happy if people need definition for mutual aid and abolition, maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A, because we have 10 minutes before Q&A, if I'm correct. I'm not very good at time, so if someone else wants to tell me. I do want to see if we can talk a little bit about grief, and I mean, we also want to talk about trust and messiness. So I don't know, where do you want to go with this?
We can do it. We can do it, because these are all connected. Grief, trust, messiness, and embarking on a healing journey with someone, right? That, I hate to use the J word, journey, but it is. We often say, you know, healing is not linear, right? Which is super, super, super just resonant for me as an individual, as a survivor of childhood sexual trauma, and a survivor of adult sexual trauma, and a survivor of white supremacy, capitalism, so on and so forth. Yeah, healing not being linear. Also, grief, the experience of grief, I don't see it as being linear whatsoever. And the messiness, right? And so, the messiness of all of that. And I think it comes back to relationships, honestly, because, you know, I'm thinking about you know, what have been the most healing relationships for me, or in what kind of conditions, right? What were the conditions that helped to facilitate, right, what I think has been the most like healing work for me? Honestly, I think about spaces that I got to be in with the Young Women's Empowerment Project, for instance, right, where we came together often in circle, right? And I know, shout out to Anne Russo and Dandelions in the Concrete and Missy DeBerry, right? And you know, these were spaces that brought together, right, uh, within the institution, right, this wonderful kind of alternative zone, if you will, where we can acknowledge our pain, we can acknowledge our experience, we can witness one another, and we can have a process that is well facilitated to help us kind of move through. Because I don't really know what healing is, but if I had to define it, right, I would think of it as an acupuncturist, because that's what I did for over 10 years, right? So there's a couple different ways, right? One, where is the obstruction, right? So you find where the obstruction in someone's life is, and how do you remove the obstruction of that? You can do that on an individual level and say, I'm going to move your energy, I'm going to move your blood to rectify the obstruction. Or you can go for a walk or run or have a dance party and like free up your chi and blood, so you have more access to your energy and your blood. Okay, removing obstruction, but then also identifying where there may be this is a potentially, I think it's an ableist word, deficiency, right? But like, do you just not have the blood in your body to nourish your cells? Is your nutrition just not where it could be? Are you dehydrated? Do we need to build up your chi? And you know, there are systems of, you know, using herbs and acupuncture and whatnot, but if you think about scaling that out, right, and thinking about like deficiencies or inadequacies in our groups and obstructions and whatnot in our groups, like you can really start to think about these things. So what are the obstructions to communication? For instance, how do you remove these obstructions to communication? Where do we have deficiencies in analysis and knowledge, right? How do we rectify these deficiencies through maybe mutual education? But also going back to YWAP, right? Like just the act of telling stories with one another, the act of being present with one another, and the knowledge that we're here because there's nowhere else we can be, right? We need each other, and we are all we have, right? Like that is just a vibe that stays with me from YWEP. And I also had that at Sage when we first started, right? Like the four of us, we had our collective, and it was like, this is not going to happen unless we put down our crap and make it happen. That was also not sustainable. It was lots to say about that, but like oh gosh, yeah, so the idea of like healing happening in relationship is really real for me. And yeah, what about you, Sangi? Like thinking of grief and thinking of messiness and thinking of trust.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this since the pandemic began in some ways, and also 2020 has been a year of grief for me personally. I had to put my dear dog down in February, and he battled cancer for a whole year, and he was very young, and so it's been a year, right? And right after that, lockdown and pandemic, and my parents' hometown now is the hub for, my parents live in India, and their hometown is one of the hubs now for COVID or whatever. So all these things are happening, right? And I've been thinking a lot about grief. I've been thinking about ritualistic grief. I've been thinking about grief at large. And I have a little niece now in Australia, and she is growing up in the culture that I grew up in, and I kind of don't want that for her, right? So there's all these things going on. And so I had to tell her about that I had to put our dog down, and the dog I had, his name is Mello, and he was her favorite. She always called me to talk to Mello. And I had to tell her that we were putting this dog down, right? And so I was thinking about, how do we communicate about grief? I had a point with all this. I'm not just rambling to y'all about my life. How do we communicate about grief, right? And what space does grief hold in our lives? Temporally, spatially, spiritually, whatever it is, right? What space does grief hold in our life? We work so hard to push grief away, we rush to work through grief. We want it to go away, right? But then what do we do in order to do that? We don't communicate about it, we push it away, and we don't have the language for grief, right? And I was really wishing that I was taught, I spent a whole lot of time in school, and I'm still in fucking school. And I wish that we had language to talk about grief. I've been taught language about so many things, but I don't have a language for grief. And I'm trying to cultivate it, but I have to do that quickly so I can pass it on in some ways, right? And I'm thinking that I've been thinking that grief is in small things and grief is in big things, right? Grief can come from losing my dog, but grief can also come from my mug being broken, or my plant being, like I killed my plant accidentally, right? That is big grief. But anyway, grief can be small to big, in micro moments to a long time. Grief can come and go. So I think we need language to talk about grief. And I think that grief is a continuous process, and that we need to hold each other, and we need to, as you said, we need each other, right, to be able to process and move through and sit with this ugliness of grief. And that doesn't look clean, that doesn't look easy, not just going through grief, but also for who we need. It's not easy it doesn't look clean for the people we need in grief, right? And so it's messy all around, and it's continuous all around in some ways too. And so how do we develop language? How do we develop skills? How do we develop community around this, right? How do we develop community that's rooted in messiness and is okay with that? We, in one way, we all already are part of messy communities. We just don't want to fucking accept it. We just want to make it all clean and easy, and we just want it to go away. And I think if we sit our entire life wanting what our life is to go away, then we will never experience our lives, right? We will never experience healing. We will never experience liberation if we're wanting it all to go away. I think we have to sit in it. We have to be in the messy. We have to wade through it together, and we have to hold each other through all that grief. And so yeah, those are the pieces I'm thinking about. But I think in the midst of this, the fucker is trust, right? The thing that white supremacy has ruined for all of us is trust, and like trust building. You know, we're in fear. We're in fear of like not figuring out what to trust and how to trust. And I think that our white supremacy culture is in one way like a big thing to blame in some ways for that, right? And so yeah, I think I struggle with that. And that often for me causes messiness in the work as well. I'm writing to somebody in prison, right? Like, how do I build that trust? What does that look like? What does that friendship look like? What does that community building look like when in the middle of me and that person who's writing letters to each other, there's a huge thing called fucking prisons. I swear a lot.
Yeah.
I'm swearing a lot today. I'm in that mood.
I'm with you.
Yeah. There's a huge wall there's a huge cage in between us, right? And so how do we build through that? What does trust building look like there? And what does grief look like there? How do we communicate about the grief that we're both experiencing on other side, and one person inside a cage and me outside a cage, right? And so I think that what does that building look like? So I think I'm just offering more questions than obviously answers or anything. I haven't worked any of this out for myself. But you know, these are the questions I'm sitting with when we think about those pieces. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, trust is a mega one, you know, and you know, I really have to, I think about like what's at stake if we don't open up and if we don't join a formation, or if we don't initiate a project, right? What's at stake, right? And right now the stakes are so high, right? We're facing fascism, which we really need to get it together, right? I feel like if I can have a bossy moment, it's like we need to get it together. Do I need to trust and love every single person that I am working with? I personally don't think so. I need to have just enough trust, right? That if you say you're going to create the Google form, you're going to create the Google form. That's good. Okay, we can work with that. Or, you know, but do I need to trust that if I tell you a deep, dark secret, you're not going to go tell? So that's not where I'm at. So it's kind of like that saying from Adrienne Marie Brown, right? Like moving at the speed of relationship, right? I really like that language. Building relationship, being like, cool, man, we could be together just to work on this project that does this cool thing. That's good enough, right? That's a place to begin and build relationships, and I can show you that I am reliable, right? Because you have it's about actions. It's about what you end up doing, you know. That's one thing I think about. And then the other thing I was thinking about was trust and messiness. Oh, yeah, like giving people a chance, giving people, in some cases, another chance. Like if you've been in Chicago for at least 10 to 20 years, like in the social justice movement, chances are someone has said something about you that wasn't very nice. And you've heard something about other people that wasn't very nice. And if if you are able to be like, cool, heard, I'm going to put that in the file of things I can't unhear. And I'm also going to say, you may have been a fucker and you may have done harm, right? And guess what? We all do harm to one another. We're all capable of being harmed, right? And can we give one another the chance to do better, right? And to be better than, you know, the worst thing that we ever did, right? I'm not saying it right, but
on the mark.
you know. And then I think about this quote that I just sent over privately. You know, Cindy Milstein wrote a beautiful, edited a beautiful anthology called Rebellious Morning. I really do recommend it for this moment. In all moments, but it's a beautiful anthology of writing that talks about different kinds of grief and how people have come together collectively to acknowledge it and resist the conditions that created the loss, right? And so she says in the anthology, our grief can open up cracks in the wall of the system. It can pry open spaces of contestation and reconstruction, intervulnerability and strength, empathy and solidarity. And I think we could spend like 2 hours just breaking that quote down, but you know, there is a way that like, and going back to traditional East Asian medicine, which is where I come from as a professional, but I've internalized it, so here we are. But this idea of, you know, there's something about grief that can absolutely create this like moment, right? Where you just want to like sink in and pull back. And I think that's right. And I think that's okay. And I think it's really fine to honor that. And in this idea of yin and yang, right? Within the most yin withdrawn moment also lives the seed of yang, right? So within the most contracted, withdrawn, isolated moment, there's a seed of expansion. There's a seed of reaching out again. And I think like to be open to that seed, being present and just connecting with that seed and letting it do what seeds do, right? You're the gardener. But I think we can get to that idea of, you know, grief opening up cracks in the wall of the system, right? How do we get vulnerable? How do we show we're, you know, we're human? How do we have real talk? Where can we have real talk, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a ton we can talk about, but I do want to honor people's curiosities, which is what brought you all here in the first place. So Tanuja and I can continue our conversation on the phone after if we wanted to flesh out all these things, but we want to, yeah, bring in people's curiosities and make space for that and see if we can sit with those questions if we don't have anything more than that. Questions are great. So yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for these very needed conversations right now and reminding us like so powerfully that we are what we need and that we can be, you know, we are the growers of healing in our lives. Yeah, and so I think while we wait for folks, so folks can either send us the questions, and while we're waiting, I can offer a few. So as y'all mentioned, healing justice is messy and anti-capitalist, and due to the very individualistic and isolating structures of our society, it is so easy to disconnect from one another. And now even more so in our current climate, like of today, even being on Zoom, it's just so hard to connect. How would you offer, or how do you actively counteract these structures of disconnecting from one another and trying to establish a more deep and communal care? And what would having a deep communal care look like, or how would someone try to cultivate that or start cultivating that right now in their everyday life?
That's a good question. I could start us off. You know, one of the things that I feel like I have relied heavily on in this moment of this form of disconnection is disability justice work. I think there's a lot of folks who are actually having more access to things and conversations and people that they haven't had before. So there is disconnection, but there's also connection and moment for, as Tanuja said, where there's, you know, there's this sort of like going inside, there's also a seed, right? There's room for growth. There's spaces for us to think about some things right now. And I think one of the things that some of my CRIP friends have done with me and we've done for each other and building a practice of is to actually ask how someone wants to connect. Not everyone wants to connect in the same ways, right? And I think asking can be so useful. Me included, I assume and think I know somebody, and I don't think that that's always true. I think you know, one of my friends and I, every week we check in about what would our friendship look like? What would being friends look like this week, right? And what do you have? And I think that's grounded in this question of what do you actually have spoons for? We don't always have to, you know, stick to, I don't know if I'm going to say this out right. I think we have to show up for each other. Our commitment is to each other, not to time. I think our commitment is to the needs of each other, not to the commitment we made to our calendars. So I think if we reframe what our commitment to each other can look like, then we can allow room and space for there to be connection in the ways that someone is able to connect, right? What they are, they're bodily and emotionally and like all of those things. Then we can actually be in community with each other in such a way where we're actually asking for people's needs and not just relying on connection to be a brunch date with you know, mimosas, although I love that and miss that. I think that if our connection is grounded in the need that we have, then we can go a long way, and we can actually be in community with folks who've always been pushed out, aka crip folks, right? So yeah, that's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, thank you for that. I also think about, you know, the decades worth of thought and practice that we all are just gifted with from the disability justice movement, right? And like I think about, you know, one example from Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha, who's the author of Care Work, and you know, just this example of like keeping frozen turkeys in the freezer because anyone could come over at any time, right? And you can be able to pull out a turkey, right? So building the kind of relationship, right, where someone with consent, obviously, right, knows like, cool, you need a place to go. Here we are. My home is open. My space is open. We have this kind of relationship where we can connect on something as really fundamental and yet so private as access to food, right? And it makes me think about like making public these things that we often just keep private and keep secret for whatever reason, right? So like publicizing or publicizing, what's the word I'm trying to come up, oh, communalizing, yeah. I'm gonna sit with that one. But anyway, deprivatizing what we often consider just like, okay, this is my personal thing. So grief, right? My grief is actually a political thing, right? And, you know, we've heard this over and over again, like the personal is political, but really what does that look like? And Sangi, I love this idea of like talking about the thing that you're trying to do. So we are trying to do friendship. What is that? What does that look like this week? You know, and I really wish I had had these conversations with people like last year, because these expectations can really exist that are outdated, right? Like, I expect you to show up in these ways for me. And when you do not, because of your own capacity, now you're a bad friend. Now we're done, right? But what if we had had some conversations rooted in consent and vulnerability and, you know, real talk, like your actual capacity to even have someone in your life? Like, wow, thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is a practice that my friend and I are building now, and I think we weren't prepared for this. We were in survival mode. We've been in survival mode for so long. I don't think we were in a place where we had the time and space to be prepared for the shitstorm or any of the shitstorms that we've gone through, or that I don't know that we're 100% prepared for the shitstorm that is to come, although we'll see. But, you know, so I do think that I want to just, I'm saying that to say, I hope that you aren't beating yourself up about not having them last year. The time is now, right?
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you so much for that. I haven't had any folks send me a private message for questions.
Neither have I.
Okay. Well, I also have,
I have one. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I have
Yeah,
one
yeah.
from Ronak. It says, love to TNS. My question, do you think that the past decade of healing and transformative justice, feminist organizing in North America has adequately prepared us for this renewed moment of fascism and imperial warfare? In what ways do we need different survival strategies that we could not have anticipated given all that's gone down in 2020?
Ironic.
Do you want to tackle that, Sangi?
I see the book. Bring it on. Bring it on.
So the past, 20 years, I would say, has given us this wonderful workbook, co-authored by Shira Hassan and Mariam Kaba. And honestly, I think there are some of us who've been, fumbling around with what does community accountability and conflict resolution look like. We've been fumbling around, making mistakes for decades. And I think in that fumbling, we have learned some lessons about what doesn't work, right? What actually doesn't help us, prevent and intervene and transform and ultimately repair harm, right? And we have so many tools like this to fall back on, right? And to advance. And one of the tools that I actually must lift up is the clearing circle. I don't remember what page it's on. But, it's this practice that I had the honor of learning from Shira Hassan and others, co-learning, right? But the clearing circle, that 4-part circle where you, after building community with one another, you're able to name and express, what are the hurts? What are any regrets or things that you wish you had done differently? What might be next actions, and some appreciations, right? And like, I'm so grateful that I had the chance to kind of learn and embody this tool, because it's really adaptable, and you can truly, adapt it to the need at hand. And one of the things that we'll be doing in the conflict group that I'm a part of is just holding space for these clearing circles so that people can come and experience what it feels like, experience kind of the messiness and awkwardness, but also how to move through those messy, awkward pieces to build collective skills, because we do need more people who can hold these types of circles and troubleshoot in the moment and, get us to where we're trying to go. So that's one thing. What do you think, Sangi? What have we gained from?
I mean, I don't know, right? Like, Ronak's question feels large and also feels large and not doable, but also feels can be tackled in some other ways. So I'm sort of sitting with a contradiction. I think that we have a lot we have a lot that we're standing on in some ways, right? Or sitting with in some ways, that we have the work that has been done and is continuing to be done, that we've learned from, and for like centuries in some ways, right? Historical, like intergenerational work, ancestral work, like we have all of that, right? So I don't think that all of that work is in vain. We are here from that. I also wanted to say, I think maybe a few months ago, Tanuja, you posted this question on Facebook. I didn't ask you permission to bring this up, and I hope that this is okay, but you asked, what do people's self-accountability practices look like? And I've been sitting with that question a lot, and Tanuja has taught me so many skills over however long I've known you in immediate and also in like communal ways, right? And one of them is writing and journaling in 3 different journals in a day, and I love this practice that Tanuja shared with me. I have embraced it for the past all of my summer, and I'm really benefiting from it. But one of the pieces in that sort of like writing everyday practice is, how do we think about self-accountability? I think if we are to face the imperial warfare, as Ronak asked, I think we can't always rely on somebody else to tell us where we went wrong. I think the labor has to be ours too. I think that if we're steeped in a punitive system, and if we're waiting for our actions and behaviors to be pointed out as problematic from other people, and there's some magical notion of being held accountable, which doesn't actually exist, as Miriam has said over and over again, I think then we all need to engage and think about what is our own accountability to practices of self-accountability. I think without that, we can't necessarily think about a warfare that we're about to confront, right? Or is already in progress in some ways and has been. So I think that, you know, these sort of daily practices amount to something. They like matter. And so I think I've been sitting with that and thinking about that a lot, and wondering what my practices around that would look like, and how I would cultivate rituals around it, and for myself and for my people who I want to sort of have in that space, right? In that intimate space of self-accountability. So I think we do, and we also, I think the other thing that we have is each other. I don't know if writ large we are ready for this imperial warfare, but within our communities, within our tight communities, we have to protect each other, and we can stand by each other, and we need each other, and like, you know, we've got each other. And I think that there's hope in that, there's joy in that, there's celebration in that, there's grief, and there's pain, and there's all that shit, right? Like, it's a beautiful package that we have each other, and I think that we got to hold on to that in this time more than ever.
Thank you for that. I have someone actually, a couple people send a couple questions, and I know that we're coming up at time, but one was about how can white people be better allies in terms of healing? That's one, maybe one of you could take that. And the other question is about working in large hospitals that seems to thrive on the divide between patient and provider. And as a social work intern, this person says they feel powerless to intervene when doctors and nurses are talking about patients in a way that dehumanizes them. Do you have any tips to incorporate healing justice and combating white supremacy and ableism when working in a large hospital setting? So those are 2 questions. How can white people be better allies in terms of healing, and how does this manifest itself in a hospital environment in terms of the divide between patient and doctor, and being able to, you know, create a healing, you know, incorporate healing justice.
Cool. I really want to focus on the second question, but I want to share a resource that I created that can answer the first question. While I'm finding this resource, Sangi, do you have thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I have some thoughts about the second question. Since you're finding resources around that, I'll sort of start there also and be quick. I think that there's a couple of things, right? I think there's ways I've worked in psychiatric settings in a different, like in a sort of not necessarily a psychiatric hospital, but a kind of a similar space. But I think that there's ways to live your values. So if healing justice and abolition and those pieces are important to you, then I think there's ways to live those values without expecting the institution to embrace it. I don't think we can find solutions within already existing institutions. I don't think the solution is to make our hospitals and doctors embrace abolition and make hospital a transformative justice institution. It's not going to be, right? So I don't think the fight is there. I don't think the energy needs to go there. I think the energy can stay in a space where how do you embody that? How does your work involve that? And how does your fight in that space, your struggle in that space have to do with humanizing people? What are the ways in which these in spaces where people are dehumanized, what is it that you can bring? What is it that your values can bring to humanize people, right? Ultimately, I think institutions that are carceral, albeit medical industrial complex, which is a part of the carceral complex, do need to be abolished, right? So I think that I think when we think about disability justice, psychiatric institutions need to be abolished as much as jails need to be abolished. All of these spaces are dehumanizing people. And so I think that the fight is in how can you humanize interactions, micro moments, spaces, experiences, right? While the larger struggle to abolish institutions continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, thank you, Sangi, is like, what are all of those little, micro moments of intervention that you can make? So, can we change certain things in the forms? Can we allow room for more consent in any kind of process? Can we interrogate what are the things we're taking for, what are the assumptions that we're making at every single level, and can we interrogate that in any kind of small way, and change the literal policies, right? So that, like, this is what we did at Sage. We put a lot of time and effort into how we create our intake forms, for instance, and things that we asked, but also things we didn't ask. The way that we asked questions was really important to us. So yeah, I feel like we could really talk a long time about that second question. It really was a major contradiction and really huge conversation that we had with, for instance, nurses who were like, I am invested in healing justice and I am a nurse and I work in a hospital. How do I practice healing justice within that framework, right? And there are some things you can truly do, some things you truly cannot. And so how do you keep yourself intact, right? While you do as much as you can to do harm reduction, right? But also like advance the humanity of everybody, not just the patients, but every single person in the room, because the institution is built to commodify, dehumanize, and so on and so forth. In terms of the first question about how white people can potentially be better allies, I just wanted to share, a tool that I developed for really anyone who has grown up, like myself, in very heavy, deep white supremacy culture. And so I basically looked at the article from Dismantling Racism and looked at the characteristics of white supremacy culture and was like, oh, okay, let's break it down. Like, so today, how did I perpetuate a overweening worship of the written word? Or today, how did I insist upon perfection? Today, how did I center urgency in a situation that really wasn't urgent, right? And I really do recommend, like, yes to the individual practice, and set up a group, like set up a self-study group and like build relationships, keep it real, have real talk.
Yeah. I'll just add to that real quick. Like, I think there needs to be, white folks need to get together in spaces and think about what these things mean. And I think those conversations need to happen. And I also think ceding space is really important. Anne Russo has written an amazing book called Feminist Accountability. There's a lot of pieces in there that can be looked at. I also think allies is a really weak word. I'm tired of allies. I don't need any. Don't know if other people do. I think harm reduction is important, but I think there needs to be more like accompliceness. There needs to be like more power, like just more strength and more action related kind of stances that white folks can take, including ceding space to Black folks. And so I also don't think it can, I also don't think the work ends in everyday micro interactions. I think that there needs to be ceding space in a structural way that isn't just boiled down to simple identity politics, but is actually deeper than that. And again, and it's a really amazing model. I think that, you know, I'm learning from her. I hope all of you can.
I have a final question from Samantha. I'm interested to hear if any of the panelists have struggled with doing abolition work while understanding that as a student, we are essentially engaging with a system that perpetuates the erasure of Indigenous perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Yes, I have struggled with that. Struggled with the, you know, invisibility of Indigenous perspectives. I try to listen very hard. And, you know, going back to healing justice, like when we create healing justice practice spaces, that is one of the things that I really learned from the badass visionary healers out of the Bay that includes Leah Lakshmi, Pyepshna, Samrasana, and others. It's like we begin by listening. So, you know, reading the works of Indigenous people who are sharing them. But it is a struggle. I do struggle with that. And like I was saying earlier, I can't remember if I said it when we were recording or before we were recording, but you know, I do occupy the space of being a settler colonial who's also a subject of colonialism, and that does impact, right, who I see, what I look for, how I even ask who's here, who's not here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think definitely struggle with that. And I think, you know, being a settler here and an immigrant, so I'm sort of here by choice in some ways, but I'm also here as an immigrant, right? And I'm reading words and I'm sitting in an institution that some ways embraces me and in other ways doesn't, and my existence is on the backs of erasure of some other people, right? And so I think that is a struggle, right? Like that's a struggle not just in reading something and sitting with discomfort, it's about living in discomfort. It's about breathing discomfort, right? And so I think what we do with that is very important. What we do with that discomfort is really important for the work. I think that that's what your needle should be, or that's what I tell myself my needle should be, right? My discomfort is often my needle. And I think that I think it's about what we do with that struggle and not wanting the discomfort to go away. And it's hard, right? It's not always possible. It's not always possible, and it's very easy to roll back into just feeling comfortable and to push away discomfort. And it's very easy to do based on where we have what kinds of privileges, right? But I think that if we reframe our discomfort as our needle, then we can sort of move more in the direction of who's not here and what I'm not seeing, rather than run away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and making that distinction between discomfort and harm, right? Super, super important. And I think it can speak to that question of like how non-Black people can really show up in this moment, you know, and saying like, okay, because I feel very uncomfortable, that doesn't mean I'm being harmed in this moment, right? I may be being held accountable in this moment. I may be experiencing a learning moment. I may be experiencing like an expansion of my range in this moment, right? And that comes with sensation, and those sensations may be uncomfortable. You know, we talked a lot about that when I was doing acupuncture, was, you know, like, here's what is within the normal range of sensation while you're experiencing acupuncture, right? You might feel a momentary needle prick, that should go away. Then you might feel numbness, pressure, tingling, traveling sensation, hot, cold, all of that, right? Sometimes if I was working with somebody who was very used to having zero sensation, right? And zero sensation is the norm, right? And the expectation, any kind of sensation would be perceived as pain, right? So anytime someone would say, ouch, right? It would be a moment to ask, okay, can you describe the sensation you're having? And then we could really see like, okay, cool. You're having a sensation that is within the normal limits. So like, I love what you're saying, Sangi, because it really asks us to take discomfort in, right? And like sit with it and be like, this is within the normal limits of experience in a time, right, of transformation, in a time of transition, in a time where we are changing the norms. We, you know, like in theater, one thing I can say is, you know, like I see theaters installing Black artistic directors. And the question I keep having is, are they changing the structure and the economic model by which they operate? Because I have a hunch, if you're not questioning the structure and the policies and the systems by which you operate, but you're just installing the representation of quote unquote diversity, like how much closer will we get to liberation? You see what I'm saying? So that's what I thought of.
That's great. No, that's really great. Also, just never fault. If anyone is here about diversity and inclusion, please, we should have said, you might, it's too late, but you should have left this talk long ago.
Come to the next one. We can get into it. Oh yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tanuja and Sangi. I'd like to pass this over to Anne.
Thank you so much. Oh my, wow. I feel so full, and I'm so appreciative, and I think all of us are appreciative of what you brought us this evening. You know, your ideas, your stories. I mean, I feel like I learned so much from you. You know, the different paths and the practices of trying to deal with the present moment, because there's so much, right? And so I feel like you offered so many. I love the seeds. I feel like you offered us so many seeds this evening of things that we might be able to grow and expand in our own lives, our own relationships, and our own communities. So thank you. So honored to have you and appreciative of you. And so we're going to close, and I'm so happy that you all came to this event and participated in it. We will have a number of other healing justice events that will keep, I hope, building on and deepening this conversation. And we also have a couple other events that are coming up that are interconnected with healing justice as well. And one of them is tomorrow evening with Love and Protect, which the group that was brought up this evening, and actually Rachel Kydor and
Yeah.
Dina Lewis. And they're going to be doing a workshop with us tomorrow. And if you're interested, we'll send out a link for this tomorrow in our to everybody who attended this, so you can have a link to join the event. But it's social bridging, letter writing as freedom work. And Love and Protect is a grassroots collective working to support and free trans and non-trans women, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and trans men of color who've been incarcerated for defending themselves against interpersonal violence. It's a beautiful, beautiful project of support and care for incarcerated survivors, and so much of it through letter writing and emails. And so that's going to be happening tomorrow at 4:30, from 4:30 to 6, a workshop, and we'll send out the link tomorrow. And then I just also want to draw your attention to, on October 21st, we're going to have another event around abolition, in addition to the one tomorrow, which will be Black Feminism and Abolition, looking at sort of the Black feminist roots of abolition work here in Chicago. So we'll have Miriam Kaba and Beth Ritchie and Rachel Kydor and Dina Lewis, who are going to lead us in that conversation as well. So we have a lot more coming up, and thank you so much for your presentations and for all of you being here.